to invite everybody to have a seat. Now we're about to start. Thank you so much for coming today. First off, I'd like to say that this presentation is sponsored by PARC and the Program for International and Intrastate Conflict. Today we have Dr. Samuel Totten, who has been a professor at the University of Arkansas since 1987. He is the founder of the Northwest Arkansas Writing Project and served as its director from 1997 through 2007. His main research interests include Holocaust and genocide education, genocide theory, post-genocide Rwanda, and the Darfur genocide. Professor Totten was a Fulbright Scholar in Rwanda at the National University of Rwanda from January 2008 to July 2008. And while he was a Fulbright Scholar, he developed a new master's degree in genocide studies that is currently offered by the National University of Rwanda. Professor Totten is the co-founding editor of Genocide Studies and Prevention, an international journal through the University of Toronto Press, and has served as co-editor from 2005 to present. He's also a co-editor of the Journal of African Conflicts and Peace Studies through the Center for Conflict Management at the National University of Rwanda. Some of his most recent works include The Plight and Fate of Women During and Following Genocide and Century of Genocide, Critical Essays and Eyewitness Accounts, both in 2009. And his forthcoming works include First-Person Accounts of the Darfur Genocide and the Rwandan Genocide, Interviews with Survivors. Today, Dr. Totten will speak to us on the origins and prevention of genocide, methods in the study of mass murder in Rwanda and Darfur. And a fun fact that I'd like to let you know about him is that after high school, he dreamed of surfing around the world. But so far, he ended up in Rwanda, which I find that I'm sure he was more happy with than anything else. We thank Dr. Totten for presenting for us, and please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the nice introduction, and it's great to see all of you here today. Actually, somebody else wrote up the title for me. I think if I attempted to address everything in that title, I'd probably have 4 or 5 or 6 books, and we'd be here probably for the next couple of years. So what I'm going to do today is primarily focus on Darfur. And if you wish to ask questions about the prevention and intervention of genocide, whether it's related to Darfur or any place else, that's absolutely fine. It's a research interest, and I'm happy to answer questions. Let me get a sense, though, before we start. I always like to craft my talk to the interest of the group. Let me ask this. How many folks are graduate students in political science? All right, graduate students in history, sociology, psychology. All right. How many are undergrads in education? Okay, and undergraduates in history? Oh, I left out journalism. How many in journalism? Okay, the rest of you. Just call out if you would, just so I can get a sense. High school English teacher, great. Okay. International relations. Communications and rhetoric. Okay. Anybody else? Public administration. Okay. All right. What I'd like to start with is this. I'm going to be talking about the genocide in Darfur. That's an ongoing crisis. The international community began to focus on it in 2003, and here we are, 2011. People are still being killed in those villages that have not been destroyed. People are being attacked in refugee camps to this very day and in internally displaced persons camps. The internally displaced persons camps, they're within Darfur itself, IDPs. Refugees are primarily in Chad. Today, there are approximately 2.5 million people who are IDPs. There are approximately, moving towards probably 500,000 to 750,000 people in refugee camps in Chad. That's a lot of people. We're talking almost 3 million people who have been forced from their homes because they've been burned down, their relatives have been killed, and they're living in circumstances that are extremely desperate. And I'm going to show you some photos of some of the refugee camps. The situation has just recently gotten more complex. As many of you may know, Sudan has had what is referred to as a referendum, and the referendum was to decide whether the South was going to secede from the North, and that vote the vote took place about 2.5 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, and the vote is about 98+% people want to secede. Al-Bashir, the president of Sudan, has already said that he will abide by the vote, and thus we're looking at a new nation being formed in Africa. It's going to most likely be called the Republic of South Sudan. It's gotten more complex because the Nuba Mountains and the Blue Nile have been left out of that, and those people are talking about fighting now against the North, and I'll talk more about that. I just returned from the Nuba Mountains 2 weeks ago, and I can tell you that every single day people were talking about preparing to fight the North. They either want to join the South to get away from the dictatorship of al-Bashir, or they want to form their own nation. Al-Bashir, I am sure, is going to object to that, and the people in the Nuba Mountains right now are amassing weapons. And while I was there, there were rumors that the North was massing weapons along the border of the North, bordering the Nuba Mountains. So that is something to watch right now. But what I'd like to do is start with this. Well, genocide is the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a specific group of people, national groups, religious groups, racial groups, ethnic groups. Individual human beings are the ones who suffer the most. They are part of those groups. And I want to share, just to emphasize, because oftentimes we hear numbers. 800,000 to 1 million people were killed in Rwanda in 1994. approximately 6 million people were killed during the Holocaust. 1.5 million people were killed in Cambodia at the hands of the Khmer Rouge, and approximately 400,000 people have been killed in Darfur. Now, those are big numbers, but I wanted to share with you some stories that bring it down to the individual. Because what I've done the past 8 years is travel to Chad and to Sudan to interview the people, individuals who have suffered through the killing, the destruction of their villages, and their personal stories and their insights are really important, I think. So I'm going to share with you 4 stories initially, and then I will possibly come back to them as I address the antecedents to the Darfur genocide and how it has progressed over the years. The very first woman I interviewed, I was hired by the U.S. State Department in 2004 to be one of the 25 investigators to go to Chad to interview refugees from Darfur who were residing in Chad. And the data that we collected, over 1,000 interviews, the data was used by Colin Powell, then Secretary of State in the United States government. They analyzed the data, and he came to the conclusion that genocide had been and was possibly still being perpetrated in 2004 in Darfur. During that time, I was in a place called Gozbeta, southern Chad, right along the Darfur border, desert everywhere, hot, hot, hot. And we went into a camp. There were two of us. A person who was a lawyer with the Justice Department was my partner. We each interviewed separately individuals with interpreters. And the very first person I interviewed was a woman who was living in a tent by herself. She said she wanted to be interviewed. We sat down in her tent to interview her, and we all had interpreters who spoke Arabic plus at least one tribal language, Mazalit, Zagawa, or four. And it became apparent very quickly that she had been raped. She did not use the term rape. She said that the men made her do sexual things. She wouldn't go into detail. She was so despondent that it was hard to probe. She actually quit speaking 2, 3, 4 times, and we would sit 15 and 20 minutes at a time in total silence. I asked her over and over again, "Are you sure you want to be interviewed? You don't have to be interviewed." And she kept saying yes. She did want to be interviewed. She had been raped, most likely. She had not been attended to by a doctor. She had no physical examination. She did not know where her husband was, and she did not know where her young son was. When they fled from the village, they fled in different ways. She didn't know if her son or her husband had been killed during the attack, if they were still somewhere in the desert or mountains in Darfur, or whether they were together or in a IDP camp in Darfur or another refugee camp. There were about, at that time, 18 refugee camps along the Darfur-Chad border. She had been in this camp just over a year, sitting there, not knowing the fate of her loved ones. She was feeling ill, but she didn't know what. She simply said there was something wrong with her, and she wasn't sure what it was. We were told not to give anybody any medication at all, not even ibuprofen, anything of that nature, because if the people ended up getting sick and dying, it'd be our responsibility. And, of course, other people would be clamoring for medication as well. So we interviewed her and we left. Now, the very last day I was in this camp, a woman came up to me. It was a totally different woman. We were just getting ready. It was about 4 o'clock. We were leaving. And she came up and said she had been chopping wood that morning for a fire, and a splinter went in her eye. Now imagine that, a splinter going in your eye. She'd gone to the medical facility. Nobody was there. She had waited hours. Nobody showed up. You could see part of the splinter, but you couldn't get a piece of it. And she assumed that we might be able to help her. We couldn't. And we left, and there she was. Just kind of typical of the situation that people find themselves in refugee camps. Now, another story that was told to one of our investigators talks about the incidents of rape. This individual went in to a camp one evening, a refugee camp, and said that she wanted to interview women who had been raped. Now, this was a very tough situation because we had half females and half males on this team. So 13, 12, 12, 12, something like that. Most women were not willing to talk to males about being raped. Most females keep it to themselves. In fact, many do not even tell their families they've been raped. Because in their culture, women who have been raped are almost automatic pariahs. And what that means is there are women who have been told by their husbands that they should no longer consider themselves married. They've been told by the community that they have to move out of their village and that they're on their own. Now, that's not 100% the case, but in many cases, the women become pariahs. No fault of their own, obviously. So this woman went in and spoke to an UMDA. UMDA, UMDA, is a head of a village, a head of the sheikhs in the village, and said, I'm interested in interviewing women who have been raped. And he said, well, look, what we need to do is contact women, can you come back tomorrow morning? So she said yes, and he said, we've had a lot of women who have been raped, and so the interviewer brought along another interviewer, another investigator. And they got there the next morning, and the sheikh that was there said, well, we've talked to the women, and they're willing to be interviewed. And the interviewer said, all right, well, why don't we go over under this tree over here where we have some privacy so the women could speak about their experiences without anyone overhearing it. And the sheikh said, fine. So the two investigators went over, sat under the tree, and started talking about, well, I wonder how many we're going to have. What if 5 or 6 or 7 show up? Now, these interviews were an hour, hour and a half each. We focused on one person at a time. So they said, what are we going to do? We're going to have to turn these people away. Well, about 10 minutes later, coming over a ridge, women in their tobs, they look like with flowing gowns, saris that you'd see in India, just absolutely beautiful. We're walking over the ridge. First there were about 10, 15, they kept coming, 20, 25, they kept coming, 30, 40, 50, 60, about 67 women showed up, all who had been raped in Darfur by either the military from the north or the Janjaweed, the militia. And I want to make it very clear. When I say women, what I mean, girls from 8 years old up to women in their 40s and 50s. The youngest case of rape that has been documented, the girl was 5 years old. Now, as far as I'm concerned, rape is one of the most horrendous crimes that can be perpetrated against a person. But I'm not talking about a single rape. What I'm talking about is these are gang rapes where 6, 7, 8, 10 men rape this girl or woman, and sometimes for days at a time. And so these women showed up and said that they were willing to be interviewed, and even if they weren't going to be interviewed, they were there to support the women who were going to speak about their particular experiences. But this is a brutal, brutal situation that continues to dominate the lives of women in both the IDP camps in Darfur, because when they go out to get wood, and the men will not go out because they're fearful of being killed by the soldiers or the militia, they send the women out, figuring that the worst that can happen is that the women will be raped. They won't be killed. For a good number of years, the situation in Chad was such that people were not being attacked. The women would go out and get water, they'd go out and get wood, they were not being attacked. Today, the past several years, women are now being attacked in Chad by Chadians, and they're being raped when they go out to get the wood. So while this crisis is really, it's fallen off the front of the newspapers, the internet, etc., and you know, we know why. I mean, certainly we have the situation in the south. We've got Egypt today. I mean, there's always a new crisis. Afghanistan, Iraq, it goes on and on and on. Pakistan and India, it goes on and on and on. But Darfur has fallen off the front pages, but the crisis is going on to this very day. And to complicate matters, al-Bashir, the president of Sudan, several years ago, began giving land to Arabs to settle on, the land that the black Africans were forced off of. So there are about 3 million people who want to go back to their land, and there are people living on that land. And there's a crisis in the making that very, very few people are talking about. So what I'd like to do first is go through some of these photos, and then what I'd like to do is go back into the history and bring you forward. And why don't we do this? It's about 12:20. Why don't I talk for the next about, I guess, 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. But to make it more interactive, if you've got questions at any point, ask. I mean, I'm here for you. So if you've got questions, please feel free to raise your hand or call out the questions. All right. I try it? Oh, good, okay. All right, so as I mentioned, in 2004, this crisis really started being focused on by the international community in 2003. In 2004, the Bush administration decided to send a team over to Chad. Now, this was the team that I was on. Let's see. Well. Anyhow, that's me. These are interpreters. She's from the Justice Department, and she was a coordinator. And there were teams like this in 18 different camps. And basically what we were doing is every single day, from about 8 in the morning until 6 at night, we were conducting interviews, an hour and a half to 2 hours, with people about their experiences. We were just getting ready to leave, and this is where the plane was going to land to pick us up. All right, this is the GOES beta. This was the refugee camp in 2004. Basically what you saw were these tents, literally hundreds. There were about 18,000 people in this camp, and it was one of the smaller camps. It was a new camp. And you see the tukels in the back, the grass huts. Generally people did not live in those, but kept their goods in them. So two people can sleep, 2 adults can sleep in these tents. These are women waiting to see the sheikh or umda. They had problems. What they would do is they would line up every morning. These are the tobs that I talked about. I mean, it's absolutely amazing to see because there you are in the desert, and then you see these beautiful colors. This woman is one of the entrepreneurs in the camp. Very few people were selling anything. Obviously, she was selling grain. I saw one little open-air meat market where the guy would go out and hunt at night, come back, skin whatever animals he caught and hung them up on hooks in the open air and sell it. There were basically 3 stands. She was one of them, the meat stand, and then a woman I think you'll see with another stand. Just a typical family in a camp. This is basically their cooking facilities. Most people, all they had were their pots and pans and tent. That was it. Again, just a cooking area. This picture, every day I pass these people, and all of these people stood in line all day long for water. And you can see the different containers that they had. An NGO from Italy would go down to the Wadi, a river. They would load up a truck, you know, the tanker trucks that you see on construction sites, load it up with water, bring it in, put it into a big tank here, and then these people would line up and they would fill their water up and carry it to their tent area. And here the women are coming back with the water. And I would say that a lot of these people waited 6, 7, 8, 9 hours a day. That's what they did, and the children. Women, as I said, they go out, they cut the wood, they bring it in, they need it for cooking. And of course, the more they cut down, the further out they have to go, the more dangerous it becomes. These women were in the process of planting sorghum, getting ready for a new crop. Here I am interviewing one individual about his experiences. This is the woman that I interviewed, the first woman, the woman who had a hard time speaking, the one who would stop talking for 15 and 20 minutes at a time. Now, what's interesting about this photograph is, despite the sorrow that these people had, despite the atrocities they witnessed, almost every single interview erupted in laughter at some point. Somebody said something funny. Not this group. The way they're looking is exactly the way they looked for a full 2 hours. And what this man told me at the end, he said, we lost everything, everything. He said, what you see in this camp is what we have. We used to have orchards, hundreds of trees. They were all cut down by the militia. We had many tukels. We even had generators. And he said, this is what I'm left with. I'm an old man. What is going to happen to me now? I had no answer. He's still there. I revisited this camp in 1 year ago, December 2010. They're still there. I first saw them in July 2006. This woman is amazing. You can see that beautiful smile, and I used to say hi to her every day. This is the other store. And she had been raped by about 8 men and was impregnated. And every day, though, I mean, this incredible, beautiful smile. I mean, I did not interview her because there was a way that we selected people, but I really wanted to interview her to find out her story and to find out, obviously, how resilient she is. Okay, this is 2007. So what you saw was 2004. This is a different camp. This is still in eastern Chad. This is a place called Fort Shana. This is a pretty established camp, and this is a survivor of Darfur who set up a situation where he would grind sorghum and give the powder back. And basically what he did is, I mean, this thing was loud. You could hear it wherever you were in the camp. But he would take the grain that people got from World Food Program, and he would charge half of that to grind it. And so he was running a pretty good situation for himself, but it left people with half of their food allowance, which caused a lot of problems. Now, this is a remarkable story. I heard about this man. I was interviewing, and somebody came up and said, you know, you really need to interview this guy because he's got a remarkable story. So I sought him out, and this little girl, who's a cute little kid, there's no doubt about it, but she kept running around and interrupting the interview, which was kind of getting on my nerves, but, you know, what could I do, right? I was a guest, so I didn't say anything. And so at the end of the interview, he said, you want to know what my daughter's name is? And I said, sure. He said, this is Condoleezza Rice. You know who Condoleezza Rice was? The head of the State Department, right? Under the Bush administration. I said, Condoleezza Rice? He said, yeah, I named her Condoleezza Rice because I'm so appreciative of what the United States has done for the people of Darfur. And I didn't have the heart to tell him that while we gave a lot of money, we didn't do anything to protect the people from being killed, raped, forced off their land. And he said, I've got a favor to ask you. And I said, what's that? And he said, when you go back to the United States, I want you to call Condoleezza Rice. I mean, as if I could, you know, get her on the phone. And he said, what I want you to do is I want you to tell her that I want to give my little daughter, Condoleezza Rice, to her because I know that Condoleezza Rice in the United States does not have a child. So I asked him, I said, look, I said, you're kidding me, aren't you? I said, because your little girl, Condoleezza, has been running back and forth. You've been hugging her, you know, and she runs to her mama, and obviously you love her with all your heart. I said, are you telling me that if I go back and I contact Condoleezza Rice and she wants your baby, you'll give her little Condoleezza? He said, without a doubt. And he said, I'll tell you something else. If I ever am lucky enough to have a boy, I'm going to name him Colin Powell, and I'm going to offer him to Colin Powell, even though I know Colin Powell has children. But this guy had about 6 or 7 years of education, but he was so clued into what was happening internationally and specifically in Darfur, he listened to the BBC on a regular basis. And just a remarkable story. Here he is. I decided he was such an interesting guy to have my picture taken with him. This baby was suffering from malnutrition. It had diarrhea. The mother was afraid that it was going to die. She had seen the doctor several times. Nothing had happened. The mother was also suffering as well. She said that when she urinated, there was a burning sensation. And she'd gone to 4, 5, or 6 doctors, and nothing had been done to alleviate that burning situation. Now, you saw how nice and clean the tents were back in 2004. 3 years later, this is what they look like. I mean, they were starting to fall apart. The wind was amazing. In fact, the first week, after the first week we were in Chad, there was a windstorm. And so 3 of us, my interpreter and I, and the individual we were interviewing, we went into his tent. But it was, you know, it was like there was a gauze there because the sand was flying all around. And for a full week, I could not sleep on my back or on my side. I had to sleep sitting up, because otherwise I would choke, and I had to keep spitting up phlegm all night long. My point of this is, these poor people face this week in, week out, years in, year out. This is just a shot. This is for Chana. This is a camp. It's fairly well established now. And that, you know, it was interesting because you see some trees here. Chadian officials wanted to come in and have everybody in the camp plant a tree per family, and the refugees said, no way. I'm thinking to myself, as we're sitting in the heat, about 104 degrees, hey, why not? You know, it'd be nice. And they said, no, because we start planting trees here, everybody expects us to stay. The next thing you know, we'll have, instead of the tents, we're going to have tukals, and then we'll end up being refugees the rest of our lives. And actually, there was a battle, and one person was killed and shot and killed by the Chadian government for refusing to plant trees. Just a bunch of kids. The poor little guys, they do go to school half a day, and the rest of the day they stand around. There's nothing to do. Absolutely nothing to do. Just inside a tent where we conducted the interviews. People, you know, starting to become industrious, developing their own little projects to earn cash. Now, this is interesting. These things are amulets. And basically what people do is they'll go to a person who makes these, who ostensibly has some special power, and each one of these, there's a message from the Quran in each one, and each one protects the person from something, from illness, from attacks, physical attacks, whatever the case may be. One of the people who was telling me a story said that her brother had a necklace of these, and when the Janjaweed came into their tukul, he said, you're not going to be able to kill me because I've got these. And they took out a long knife and shoved it almost all the way through his gut, and he died right there. And they found out, obviously, that these amulets don't work as well as they think. These are bricks getting ready to build their homes. Okay, 2009. I took this shot. 2009, I hopped a UN plane down to Goes Beta, where I had been in 2004. Took this picture just to show you. This is what it's like. It takes 5 hours in the UN plane to get to the east. This is all you see out there. I mean, it's dry, 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 except for the wadis during the rainy season that fill up. The reason I took the UN flight, because usually I drive cross-country, is the Chadian government has mandated that nobody can drive up and down the east any longer without an armed convoy. It's that dangerous. So to get around that, I flew in. This woman was a very interesting woman. She's a teacher in Darfur. She was visiting her husband in Jamina. This is in Jamina. And she had just married her husband back in Darfur, and he was killed a week later. He was a leader of a rebel group. And so the rebel group asked her to meet with them, and she met with them, and they told her, you were the wife of our leader. It's our responsibility to take care of you. If you want, you can marry one of us. If you don't want to, that's fine. And so she married the man who she thought was the boldest, the bravest, and she married him. And she told me, she said, initially there was no love between us, but I married him to support our men in Darfur. I can't fight, so I support the rebels. And she said, this was like now 3 years later, and she said, now my husband and I love one another. We have love between us. This is back in the camp in Goes Beta. This is now December 2010, and Remember I said there were no stores at all except this little meat market, that one woman who was smiling, and then that one woman with the grain? Now, all up and down this road, there are no tents, there are all tukels, and there's store after store after store. And this is exactly what the people are afraid of, is becoming sedentary. They are becoming sedentary, and they're fearful that they're going to remain in Chad the rest of their lives. And there you are. This is the same shot where there were tents. I think there were about 3 or 4 tents. There had been 18,000 tents. What happened is they wore out, the sun wore them out, they started ripping, they replaced once, and then the UN said we're not going to replace them again, and so they were forced to build their tukels. This was an Umda, very powerful fellow. He had very interesting insights. He gave me a message to send to Obama. He told me, he says, you know what? I know what your president said during the run-up to the election. He promised that he would be more proactive to protect us in Darfur than the Bush administration. He said, but nothing, the U.S. government has done nothing. Can you please write to him and ask him to keep his promise? And he wrote out this long letter. I mean, I took it down. He stated it in Arabic, and I wrote it in English. Now, I end up in Goes Beta, where I initially was, in 2004. This is 2010, and it turned into an armed camp. There were now people racing around with RPGs, automatic weapons. This is the only photo I took, because they said if I took another photo, I'd be arrested, because it was now a militarized area. This is an Oxfam. This is one of the only women, other than the first one, but she came out and told me flat out she had been raped by 6 men and she wanted her story told. Very brave woman. All right, so that gives you a sense of Chad, okay? All right, are there any questions before I get into the antecedents, and we're going to go fairly fast, how this whole crisis started and where we're at today? Are there any questions? Yes?
How do you see the younger generations, how are they dealing with the idea of the conflict? Do they have more envy?
Yes, that's a great question. In the internally displaced persons camps in Darfur, there's a very serious problem. There's drinking among the young, and there's fighting among the young amongst themselves. The young now in many camps are carrying weapons, and they're becoming threats to their very own people. During all of my travels in Chad, I only came across 3 men who were drunk. But what I heard from the people in Chad in the refugee camps is this: the UN will only provide schooling up to 6th grade. Now, some of these people have been in these refugee camps since 2003. So that's, what, 8 years? These kids are ready to go on to high school. A lot of them aspire to go to college. And so they're sitting around with absolutely no hope. And that is causing a lot of grief amongst the adults and the teenagers. Yeah, that's a great question. Anything else? Yeah. Yeah, well, that's a complex question, but I mean, the answer to your first question is, it doesn't have to involve killing. No, it doesn't. It's destruction in whole or in part, and there are different ways that it could be done. For example, in Rwanda, women were being raped and told that they were being raped to have Tutsi women produce Hutu children. In Darfur, black African women, and the people refer to themselves as black Africans, girls and women have been raped, and they've been told as they're being raped, we're going to create red tomatoes, because the Arabs there consider themselves red, not black, though they're as black as one another, right? I mean, they look, it's hard to discern who's supposedly Arab, who's black. They also said that the Janjaweed, we are going to create Janjaweed babies. These babies and these women are pariah. What it means is the women will often no longer have husbands, as I mentioned. People will not marry them, even if they're outside the camp and find out that she's been raped. And the children are often referred to as Janjaweed babies. In Rwanda, the babies that resulted from rape are actually referred to by many, if not most, as rape babies. Now that's a weird juxtaposition, rape babies. I mean, it's very bizarre. And at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, which is being held in Arusha, Tanzania, there was a case that found a person guilty of genocide for overseeing rape of women. So now what you're talking about, structural, that's something else altogether. And then we start looking at what is the distinction between cultural genocide, genocide. There's a new term that's been coined relatively recently called genocide by attrition, where food is withheld from people, or where medical help is withheld, water is withheld, etc. Yeah, so I mean, that's another whole issue, very complex. But no, genocide can be perpetrated in different ways. Yeah, but genocide scholars generally make a distinction between cultural genocide, ethnocide, and genocide. Okay. Are there any other questions? All right. Tell me if I go too fast. Basically, no genocide is a result of a single reason, and that's certainly true of Darfur. I mean, there are many reasons that created the conflict, and I'm going to look at a number of them. First of all, the area was hit by a major drought in 1985. And that drought had dire impact on all people there. It had an impact on the sedentary black Africans because they're farmers. And without water, they can't grow the crops the way they want to, as many crops as they want. It had a dire impact on the nomadic people, generally who were Arabs, and they would take their animals on a regular path, traditionally over the years, and of course they depend on water, and they depend on the succulents in the desert for their animals. Traditionally, the nomadic people would come down onto the farms and they would ask permission. This is back in the, back 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. They would ask permission to allow their animals to graze outside of the farms. So they would graze on grazing land. Almost to a person, the black Africans said yes. And I've been told over and over again, our umdas and our sheikhs would actually be invited to weddings and other celebrations by the nomads. And we actually appreciated having the nomads come because their animal, it was a symbiotic relationship. And what I mean by that is this, is that the nomads would be able to graze their animals, the animals would fertilize the land for the sedentary people, and then they'd move on. But in the 1980s, as a result of this drought and a famine, and at that time there were a number of wars going on in this region. Libya was fighting Chad. Eritrea, there was a war there. There was conflict in different places in Sudan. And while there was a drought of water in Darfur, there was a flood of weapons in. And a lot of the nomads were hired as mercenaries by the government, by the different governments. And so they were accustomed to having automatic weapons with them. And so as the drought increased, as the famine increased, they would bring their animals, the nomads would bring their animals down lower, and the nomads became more belligerent. They would let their animals feed on the farms, trample the farms, destroy the farms. And when people came out, and I heard this over and over again, when people would come out, black Africans, and confront the nomads, oftentimes the nomads would say, "Speak to the Kalash," mean speak to the Kalashnikov. You want a problem? We'll give you a problem. We'll shoot you. So from about 1985 all the way through 2003, there's attack after attack after attack after attack by nomads against black Africans, but nobody in the international community seemed to focus on that. And I met people whose villages had been burned down 4 and 5 times, and they would go back, rebuild, start their life over again, only to have it attacked again. Now, sometimes the villages weren't burned to the ground. Sometimes only half of them, or a third of the tukels were burned to the ground. So the people would come back, build, and continue their life. But even in the 1990s, there were people going across the border to Chad to get away from this ongoing violence. So we've got the ongoing violence, we've got the famine, we've got the drought. Now the other thing is that al-Bashir, the current president, became president in a coup d'etat in 1989. Shortly after becoming president, Sharia law was imposed. Sharia law, fundamental Islamic law, means basically that if you, for example, steal, you have an arm cut off. If there's adultery, you can be stoned to death. Now, what's interesting is the people in Darfur are all Muslim. The government in Khartoum, Muslim. But the people in Darfur, not all of them are fundamentalists. Many are not fundamentalists, and they didn't want to live under the imposition of Sharia law, and they balked at that. So there's another problem. On top of that, well, Sudan is one of the poorest countries in the world. Darfur is one of the poorest regions in Sudan. And people were complaining. No roads, no bridges, few schools, few hospitals. They were being taxed, but they were not getting any resources back. And over and above that, al-Bashir sent people from Khartoum, fundamentalists, to take positions away from the local black Africans, and so now the black Africans were being governed by Arabs. All of these things, slowly but surely over time, created this sense of acute frustration within the people. Some of the black Africans began purchasing weapons to try to protect themselves in the 1990s, but generally they were outgunned. And when they reported attacks, they would report the attacks to the police and the government soldiers, only to discover that because they were government officials from Khartoum, those officials would look the other way and say, well, we can't do anything about it. So the frustration increased even more. In the early 2000s, a rebel group was formed. There were 2 rebel groups. One was called GEM, J-E-M, the Justice and Equality Movement. And GEM issued what they referred to as a black book, delineating their views of how they were being discriminated against, how they were being disenfranchised. And they printed this thing, and this black book ended up all over Sudan. Now, I don't know if it's an apocryphal story or not, but supposedly a copy of this black book ended up on the desk of Omar Bashir. But what they did is the GEM would hand this thing out after prayers on Friday night, and those people who could not read, who were illiterate, had it read to them. And basically what the black book said is, look, this is the way we've been disenfranchised. And all of the things I said. We don't have representation in the government. We're denied governing ourselves in Darfur. We don't have water systems here. We don't have clean water. We don't have bridges. We don't have roads. We don't have hospitals. We have few schools. And you're imposing Sharia law, and you're imposing fundamentalist schooling on our children. We want to govern ourselves. We want resources here for roads, clean water, hospitals, etc. And so it was a challenge to the government. And when the government did not respond, that's when the rebel groups began to attack government edifices, civil buildings, military installations, and etc. And in 2003, the rebels attacked a military installation, knocked out a jet, kidnapped a high government military official, and stole trucks, four-wheel vehicles, and weapons. And the government was very, very concerned, because during this same period, you have to remember, the North, Khartoum, was engaged in a civil war in the South. A 20-year civil war from 1984 to 2000, early 2000, 2004, 2005. 2 million people were killed in that civil war. The government had soldiers in the South and didn't have enough soldiers to carry out the fight in Darfur, to prevent these rebels from attacking it. So what they did is they went out and they hired nomadic Arabs, the militia that became the Janjaweed. Janjaweed basically means devils on horseback. And as I always say during these talks, any government is going to attempt to halt attacks against itself. It's the military. And what they're going to do is they're going to go out and they're either going to arrest those individuals or they're going to kill them. And it doesn't matter if it's Sudan, it doesn't matter if it's the United States, it's going to be stopped one way or the other. That's legitimate. But what the leaders of Sudan decided to do was to carry out a wholesale scorched earth policy. And basically what that means, very simply, is instead of going only for the rebels to halt their attacks, to arrest them or to kill them, they started attacking black African village after black African village. And when they went in, the attacks were almost always the same. An Antonov, which is an old transport plane that they purchased from Russia, would fly in and drop bombs at 4, 5, 6 o'clock in the morning before the sun came up. That was followed generally by attack of Janjaweed on horses and camels, and there would be 400 to 500 of them coming in with automatic weapons. They would attack women in the fields, rape them. They would attack people praying. They would burst into homes, and generally they killed the men and the boys and raped the girls, and they would burn down the villages. To burn these villages down would take sometimes 3 and 4 days. These villages were big. Before they burned the villages, they would basically pull out anything of value, and oftentimes the government would provide big tractor trailers to load this stuff up so that the government then could claim these goods. Everything from the bags of sorghum, the other grain, farm implements, if there were, and there rarely were, if there were vehicles of any sort, if there was money, etc. They would collect it and take it away, and then they would burn these villages down. After the 400 or 500 Janjaweed attacked, then, and this is interesting because the government claims that the Janjaweed are the ones who are responsible for the atrocities, not the government. So this is an important point. Following the Janjaweed, there would always be attacks by land cruisers, four-wheel vehicles, sometimes four-wheel vehicles, you know, like a pickup, but called dushkas, because they'd have a machine gun on the back. These were driven by government military. Now, you know that a guy who's riding a camel around Sudan or a horse is not flying the planes either. My point here is, this was a combined effort of the government and the Janjaweed. And these attacks began in 2003. They really spiked in 2004, 2005, and it would kind of go up. There'd be valleys. and hills and mountains, and began to taper off in 2006 with periodic attacks now and then. When I was in the Nuba Mountains 2 weeks ago, there was an attack in Darfur. Now, people were saying for a long time, hey, there are no more villages to attack in Darfur. Well, it's not the case. People have gone back to their villages, some. There are some villages that have not been attacked, but they continue to be attacked. And not only that, now the IDP camps are being attacked in Darfur. So, what has the international community done about this? Well, in December 2003, the United Nations declared Darfur as the worst humanitarian disaster in the world, and that's when the international community started focusing on Darfur. And in the United States, all of a sudden people jumped on this, and you had student organizations, you had religious organizations, you had non-governmental organizations drawing attention to this, clamoring for protection of the people, calling on the U.S. government to do something. But, you know, for the most part, the U.S. government wasn't going to do much because we were already in a fight where we had soldiers, and there was no way that the United States was going to attack another Muslim state. Early on, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., its Committee on Conscience, they closed down the first time ever in the history of the museum. They closed it down for the morning, and they brought in survivors from Darfur, experts on Sudan, and they discussed what needed to be done. During this time, there are two people at USAID, one Roger Winters, who's a longtime expert on refugees, and Andrew Natsios, who was the director. They began to ask themselves, what can we do to help these people? And so they started pressuring the State Department to do something. And in 2004, the State Department decided to send this team over to collect data to see, to try to ascertain what was going on. Is it truly genocide or not? Because there has to be the intent to destroy in whole or in part. If you don't have the intent to destroy, then legally it's not genocide. So what Colin Powell wanted to do was to ascertain, was there the intent to destroy in whole or in part? So anyhow, on September 9th, 2004, Colin Powell went to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and announced that genocide had been perpetrated. And he said, what we are going to do, meaning the United States, is we are going to refer this matter to the United Nations. And he said, this does not mean that, he said, basically, we're going to do what we've been doing. It doesn't mean that we're going to do anything different. And what he meant by that is providing money for the IDPs, the refugees, for food, for water, for medical aid, and call attention to this matter. What he basically meant is we're not going to send troops in to stop the killing. And so under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, and this is totally legal, the U.S. referred the matter to the UN. The UN then went in and conducted its own investigation in November, December, and January. So that was November, December 2004, January 2005. And they sent a team in. This team went not only to Chad, but Darfur, to Khartoum, to Eritrea to talk to rebel groups who were there. They went to Addis Ababa to talk to the peacekeepers and the UN. And during this period of time, November, December 2004, January 2005, the murders continued unabated. So at the end of January, the United Nations announced that, based on its documentation, its data, it came to the conclusion that Sudan had not committed genocide but crimes against humanity, which really complicated things because now you had a nation, a single nation, saying it was genocide. Now you have the United Nations saying that it was crimes against humanity. So what did the United Nations do? Referred the matter to the International Criminal Court, the ICC. In The Hague. And what did The Hague do? It then carried out its own investigation. And that investigation went on for right around 5, 6 years. Very, very thorough. And the prosecutor of the ICC finally went to the court and asked for a warrant for genocide against al-Bashir, the president of Sudan. He presented his evidence, and the judges, 2 of 3, a majority, said that no, these crimes do not rise to the, based on the evidence you've provided, do not rise to charge of genocide, and so we're going to issue a warrant for crimes against humanity and war crimes. And that went out against al-Bashir. Furious that he didn't get this warrant on genocide for al-Bashir, he went back and wrote up an appeal. The appeal went to the appeals court. The appeals court said, look, the judges are wrong because at this point in time, we're not talking about the type of evidence that will be needed during the court case to prove this point. And so they sent the matter back to these 3 judges, and the judges decided to issue a warrant for genocide against al-Bashir. So al-Bashir right now, the president of Sudan, is wanted for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. There's another person named Ahmed Haroun who, interestingly, was named head of humanitarian aid for Darfur, and but very closely aligned with the Janjaweed, and he's been charged with crimes against humanity and war crimes as well. Those 2 individuals are still in power. In fact, Haroun has been named governor of South Kordofan, which is in the Nuba Mountains, and actually al-Bashir came through the village I was working in, Kauda, several times in the past 2 weeks. I often thought, here's a guy who's wanted by the International Criminal Court, and he's free as free can be, and holds a very powerful position in the Sudanese government. So where we're at today is, we've got about 2 million people who are IDPs in Darfur, almost 1 million people who are refugees in Chad, and we've got the international peacekeepers in Darfur. They've been there for years. I'm very good friends with an individual who was deputy commander of the UN AU force, African Union force, and he told me that they're undermanned, they're outgunned, they're under-resourced, and they're on a mandate that doesn't allow them to go out and protect people. Basically, they're allowed to protect themselves, meaning the peacekeepers, if they're attacked, but as far as the people are concerned, tough luck. They even had a program at one time, meaning this African Union, UN Peace Force, to go out every evening or afternoon with women and escort them out to get wood. They discovered very quickly, hey, we don't have the manpower to do that, and so they dropped it. The other thing is that the international community called on al-Bashir, the president of Sudan, to disband the Janjaweed, and so what they basically did is they gave the many Janjaweed uniforms, police uniforms, to put them in the IDP camps as policemen. What's that old saying about, what is the fox in the chicken coop? I mean, there we are. It's absurd. All right, we've got about 15 minutes, I guess, 20 minutes. I mean, that is a quick and dirty overview of this very complex crisis. But why don't we open it up for questions, and maybe we'll go in different directions, or I can clarify something for you. So anyone? Yes?
What's the definition of crime against humanity?
It's very strange. Crimes against humanity can be anything from extermination. Now, you would think extermination is genocide, right? Extermination, torture, rape, mass killings, anything along those lines. So the question is, how does it differ from genocide? Genocide, as I said, is the intent to destroy in whole or in part. Crimes against humanity, There's not the intent to destroy in whole or in part this specific group, national, racial, religious, or ethnic. It's just as bad. But the problem is, it's often overlooked because people have latched on to genocide as to use a term that Bill Shabbos, a international lawyer at the University of Ireland in Galway, uses. Genocide is perceived as the crime of crimes, like the ultimate crime. It's really gotten us into a bind, meaning the international community, because you're not going to prevent genocide waiting until genocide is perpetrated. You've got to stop when the human rights violations are being perpetrated, and you've got to stop when crimes against humanity and war crimes are being perpetrated. That's when you stop it. That's when you prevent the potential for genocide. But this international community, individual nations, have not learned that simple lesson. Or they know it, but they're so tied into realpolitik, looking out for their own interest, that they ultimately look the other way. Now, you know, if we're talking prevention, that's another whole issue, which is very, very interesting. All sorts of people today are talking about genocide early warning systems. The United States has a plan. Interestingly, Madeleine Albright and William Cohen put out a blueprint for genocide prevention about 2 years ago. Madeleine Albright was our UN ambassador, U.S. ambassador to the UN, and basically called on the international community not to provide protection to the Rwandans. And now she's calling outside of government for a blueprint for the prevention of genocide. A lot of genocide scholars have a problem with that, because when you're outside the government, it's so easy to call for anything. But when you're in the government, hey, if the State Department says, as our State Department did, don't call the atrocities in Rwanda genocide, then Madeleine Albright will go to the UN and she won't call the atrocities genocide. So you could have the best early warning systems in the world, but if you have governments that buy into realpolitik, the lack of political will, it doesn't matter. They're not going to go out and they're not going to protect people. It's as simple as that. Now, we've had some situations that have looked more optimistic. The Australians, actually, it looked like they prevented a genocide in East Timor in 1999. And NATO, it looks like prevented a potential genocide in Kosovo in 1999, but that was very controversial, still is, because the UN did not give a green light to do the bombing in Kosovo. So, and the United States was involved in that, basically it was perceived as illegal bombing, and there were people who were talking about holding officials of the United States and NATO and the EU responsible for at least crimes against humanity. All right, good question. Others? Yes?
How do you think the current situation, the current political situation in Sudan is going to affect the fate of these internally displaced people, like the referendum and the potential division of these north and south parts?
Yeah, it's hard to tell because the people, there's a region called the Nuba Mountains and the Blue Nile. They were left out of the referendum. Those people are mad right now. They're talking about potential war. Then you've got the people in Darfur, and you've got people who are living on the IDPs and the refugees' land. Then you've got Sudan, southern Sudan. There's already an agreement to share the oil resources between the north and the south, but they haven't decided how to do that yet, what percentage. There's already conflict in South Sudan. Soldiers who have fought with the South are being told that they have to go live in the North because they're part of the North Army. And I don't know if you saw this, but there were attacks by those individuals just this past couple of days, and there was killing in the South. There are also different tribal groups that have conflicts. They've had conflicts traditionally in the South. All of those, the reason I mention all of that is there's a there are potential hotspots that could explode within South Sudan, within the Nuba Mountains and the Blue Nile, and of course you've got all of these refugees and IDPs who are seeing now all of a sudden the establishment of a new country. The question is, what are they going to do? What are they going to demand? Right now, those people are stuck. They're in a no man's land, and the international community has not focused on them because largely because they've been focused on the South. There was a comprehensive peace agreement agreed upon in 2005 between the North and the South, and the international community wanted to see this through to make sure that there was a legitimate vote and the people of the South could vote the way they wanted to. Maybe there will be more attention on Darfur now, but now there's oil exploration being conducted in Darfur. That's going to change the complexity of the situation as well. Most likely people are going to start clamoring for the wealth from that oil, and again, that's a potential point of conflict with the North. So it's a huge question mark, and it's a really important question because those people are stuck right now. I mean, if they go back, there could be a potential civil war as well. So, yes?
Just to pick up on that clarification, the people in the camps primarily, are they from the North or the South or both?
Okay. The people in the refugee camps and the IDP camps, and I should have mentioned, there are basically three major groups, tribal groups. Mazalit, 4 in Zagawa. They're all Muslim. They're all from Darfur. And Darfur is considered in the north, but Darfur is a 3-state region in the west. Those are the people who are in IDP camps. Those are the people who are in refugee camps. Now, people from the south, though, during that 20-year war, they fled as well. So they fled to different countries, and they're now coming back to the south. Now, the south, people are saying, well, the south is likely to be a bonanza for entrepreneurs, for the government because of the oil, the need to build an infrastructure. They're talking about building a new capital, moving from Juba someplace else. So there's a huge influx. In fact, when I was in the Nuba Mountains, a couple weeks ago, people were talking about how many people were coming from the north down to the south who had previously lived in the south but moved to the north to get away from the fighting. And there were so many people that they overtaxed the water system, and so there were non-governmental groups flying down to Juba and Abyei and other places to try to alleviate the problem of water. So as more people come back, there will be more problems. In Juba, Juba is outrageous. Juba, the capital of the south, you go to Juba, and this sounds crazy, but this is the way it is. It's impossible to find a hotel room. And to rent a space in a tent can be up to $200 a night. Now, the people aren't going to do that. I mean, they'll build their own little lean-to out of sticks and whatever they can find. But the point is, food prices have gone up. Everything's just sky high right now. It's going to be very, very difficult for a lot of people until they get that state up and running. Obviously, that's a point of contention too, or could be. Yes. Well, this is my personal opinion, and it's really disturbing to me that, granted, the Nuba Mountains is good size. Granted, I only covered part of it traveling around, but I bumped into one journalist from Eastern Europe. He was doing satellite radio, doing internet commentary on the internet, sending them back to his radio station. He bemoaned the fact day after day after day. He says, where are all of the journalists covering the Nuba Mountains? Because they're talking about war. And it was a good question. But we knew that they were in the South covering the referendum. So I would say the first thing is this, first of all, there are some peacekeepers in the Nuba Mountains, but they don't carry weapons. They simply drive around day in and day out. I mean, what they're doing, I have no idea. I only saw a handful of them. The first thing is the international community has to get into the Nuba Mountains and the Blue Nile and work out a problem that's amenable to both the people of the Nuba Mountains and the Blue Nile and the North. Otherwise, there's going to be a war there. If there's a war there, that can then flare up problems in the South, and that can flare up problems in Darfur. So I would say that's the first thing. The second thing is the international community better start figuring out what it's going to do with the 2 million, almost 3 million people, because they're going to watch what happened in the South, and they're going to say, hey, you worked it out with the South, you better work it out with us because we don't want to be in refugee camps any longer. So there are dual points to be focused on then. So it's the Nuba and the Blue Nile and now Darfur. The other thing is while people have talked about the South with great joy, there are a lot of potential problems that analysts have focused on. And signing the CPA, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, getting the referendum is just the beginning, because that could fall apart fast, not necessarily because of actions by the North, but by the actions or inactions of the leaders in the South, causing disenchantment amongst the people who have sky-high aspirations that, hey, we've got freedom, we've got democracy, and we're going to have a better life because of the oil resources. So they have to look at that whole country. Now, the other thing is this person I mentioned earlier, Andrew Natsios, who used to be head of USAID, who then became U.S. envoy to Sudan, no longer is. He's now a professor at Georgetown University. He was in the Nuba Mountains about a week or two before me. He's predicted that there may be a coup d'etat against al-Bashir. If that happens, that then complicates the situation as well. I mean, you get al-Bashir out of the way, but who's going to follow? The other thing is that I haven't mentioned is this guy, Hamed Haroun. Well, I mentioned him. He was the head of humanitarian affairs, who then put uniforms on the police and sent them into the IDP camps. He's now the governor of South Kordofan, and he's getting ready to run against a rebel named Aziz, A-Z-I-Z. Nobody wants Haroun to be the governor. And people in the Nuba Mountains have said, if he's elected governor again, we'll know that the election has been rigged, and we're ready to take him out and go to war with the North. I mean, they're going to have to focus, I mean, the international community, a lot of attention on Sudan. And of course, you know, I mean, where's the attention today? Egypt, right? Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, India. I mean, it makes sense. And other places. So, and there, I see no dedication by the international community to provide real protection for the people of Darfur or the Nuba Mountains right now. It's just not there. Yeah, sure. We saw that in Egypt for a while, right? Yeah, they shut down the internet, they shut down the press. I mean, you know, it wasn't a free press anyhow, right? I mean, but you have the underground press. The answer to your first question is, those people who are in the Nuba Mountains who know about it need to contact people. And I tell you what I did when I was there. I know the director of the Committee on Conscience at the Washington, D.C. Holocaust Memorial Museum. He used to be an editor of the Washington Post. I knew he had a lot of connections. So what I did is I wrote up a report based on interviews, based on information that I had gleaned. I sent it to him, and I asked him to get it out to others. He wrote back and said, I sent it to Nicholas Kristof, who won the Pulitzer Prize for his articles on Darfur. He said he sent it to the Washington Post. He sent it to the Christian Science Monitor. While I was there, people who were journalists who were with the New York Times, the Washington Post, started writing me and asking me for information. My sense was, once the referendum was taken care of, they didn't know what was happening in the Nuba Mountains. And I just mentioned a couple of things, that there was a rally of 3,000 people. They were burning the Sudanese flag. They were calling on al-Bashir to leave his presidency and to give himself up to the International Criminal Court. And people were burning down signs that said, vote for governor in April in South Kordofan, because they were so mad that Haroun was running. And the last night I was there, you know what a souk is? The souk, real small open air market. One night, the last night, a flyer was posted in Arabic, written on a computer, that supposedly was intercepted by the SPLA, and this was intercepted from, supposedly, the government of Khartoum, stating that they were sending tanks and other heavy weapons down to the Nuba Mountains. Nobody knew this. The only way you can get it is be there. And it was absolutely amazing, because when you're there and people know that you're doing research or you're a journalist, they come up to you. I had a guy in Kauda who was the sole radio announcer, journalist, come up to me and give me an incredible amount of information. The reason he did is he said, I can't do this. I can't put this on the radio because I'll be arrested. So here's what I've heard. Can you get this out? And so when I send stuff out now, I don't mention people's names. I mention it that I don't because it would put their lives in jeopardy. So that we need more journalists there, more researchers. Yeah, that's a great question. What was your second question?
What do you do when the government, seeing this, they even shut the media out? Like Sri Lanka, they got all the journalists to get out.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. I mean, because, you know, you're absolutely right. I mean, they tried to do that in Darfur, though we kept getting reports out. But, you know, the journalists would be followed everywhere they went by police, soldiers, intelligence. So they had to be the journalists had to be very wily in regard to how they got the information out. But my sense is, now that people can travel back and forth between at least the Nuba Mountains right now in the south, there are ways to get the information out, even if they try to close it down. But, I mean, if they really close it down, that is a potential problem. I mean, because you know that they'll shut down the internet, of course, and that's the way the information would come out initially. The other thing is, what I found, and I think most genocide scholars, and I don't know how many human rights activist organizations are even clued into this, I think some of the best sources of information you can get are the NGOs on the ground, not the human rights activists, but those people who are providing food, water, building schools. Those are the people I talk to, and it's unbelievable, because some of those people live in these areas that nobody else would want to live in. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years. They know all the players, all the actors. They know the politics. They hear the rumors. Those are the people to go to. But, you know, it takes somebody willing to go there. I mean, it's not easy to get to some of these places. You know, and once you're there, I mean, I'll tell you, the first night I ended up in, you know, I flew in. We just had a meeting with another group, so I don't know if I'm being redundant here. But basically what I have to do is I have to fly to Nairobi on you know, regular airlines, but then there I get a NGO flight from Nairobi that lands in a place called Ogochokio in Nairobi, and then stops in 3 places in Sudan, landing just on the ground, and then we land where I'm going, the Nuba Mountains. You get off, you walk away. There's no customs. But I go into the compound the first night, and I was telling the professor this. It was nighttime, and one of the individuals was showing me where the tukul I was going to stay in, and he said, "Look, you have to stay on the path. Don't make any shortcuts." And then he took his what they call a torch, a flashlight. There's a hole 10 by 10 by 10, and he said, "We just dug this. This is our bomb shelter because we're fearful that Antonovs might come in and bomb. And so we're all going to get in this and hope the shrapnel flies over us." So, you know, you get in there and, you know, you're only going to have certain people probably going in. But it doesn't take but a few if they can get the word out to the right people.
But in Sri Lanka, they got the NGOs out, INGOs out.
If they get those people out, then we've got real problems. In fact, there was a contingency. When I went in, you're absolutely right, I had to sign a waiver stating that the plane I flew in on, if there was an emergency, the NGO people, personnel, would come out first. If there was enough room, they'd put me on. If not, they'd leave me behind. And the only way I could get that flight in was to sign the waiver. And they were all prepared to leave if that happened. So you're right, that would close it down. Yeah. Yes?
I couldn't get the exact reason why the black Africans have been persecuted by the Arabs, right? And that I would like to go more about that. Secondly, when the refugees, what happened to the land that we left behind?
Yeah.
And thirdly, are they getting any kind of support from other black African nations?
Okay, that's three great questions. Okay, the first question is, let me take it backwards. There's some support for Darfur because you have the African Union contributing troops, right, to the peacekeeping mission in Darfur. You have, for example, Rwanda has many troops there and leaders. In fact, the commander of the AU UN force right now is Rwanda. And you have from Nigeria and from other countries. You have small contributions of personnel and resources. Okay, the second question, give me the second.
What happened to the land that was left behind?
The land. The land that's been left behind, it's either just sitting there, burned to the ground. If you go on Google Earth, you'll see just huge black circles where the villages were, where they were burned down. But over the past 3-4 years, the government has been giving the land, turning the land over to nomadic Arabs, mercenaries, and giving the land of the black Africans to those people. And those people now are building their own villages, redigging the wells, because the wells were often poisoned by throwing a human being in the well or throwing a dead donkey in the well, and farming. They're actually moving, some of these people are moving from a nomadic way of life to a sedentary way of life because now they have land and now they're beginning to operate their own farms. Now, the other question was, why the disdain between the Arabs and the blacks? First of all, Sudan is a very interesting situation. First of all, outside of the Blue Nile, White Nile region, you know, Khartoum, almost all of the people, they're referred to the peripheries. Anything outside of central Khartoum, not central Khartoum, but Khartoum, the whole region of Khartoum, they're referred to as peripheries. And the people in the peripheries, whether they're fundamentalist Muslim, black Africans, Arabs, they're referred to as less intelligent, less industrious, basically second and third class citizens. But as far as the black Africans are concerned, and this is interesting because there are scholars who say, hey, it's ridiculous talking about black Africans and Arabs. They're all black, and they're all Arabs. But the point I've made in print is, all right, maybe that's a fact. However, the people who have been attacked refer to themselves as black Africans. The people who were carrying out the attacks refer to the victims of black Africans, and they refer to themselves as Arabs. So they're making a distinction. So there are two groups there, there's no doubt. The black Africans are looked down upon as, again, second or third class people. Now, and part of the reason, and it's very fluid. I mean, this is very strange when you first hear it. It's very fluid between who's an Arab and who's a black African, and I'll give you an example. Some black Africans will move to Khartoum, and if they become more educated or richer, all of a sudden they say they're Arab. So see, that's where some scholars say, hey, there's no difference. But when they make a distinction, there's a difference. But the black Africans are looked down upon as uneducated. You look at how there's a lack of infrastructure in Darfur, all sand, no roads. They're looked upon as backwards.
Is there no attempt to upgrade them in terms of education, in terms of economic prosperity?
Can you say that again?
You see, there seems to be no intent to bring them up.
No effort, you said, to bring them up? No attempt? You're right, you're right. And I don't think there's going to be. I think if oil is found in Darfur, the North is going to claim it for themselves. And who knows how that oil is going to be used. But I have a feeling that the people are going to continue to be discriminated against. They'll continue to be disenfranchised unless something is worked out, as we saw with the CPA in the South. You're absolutely right. They're not. And that's why they ultimately decided, hey, we've asked, we've begged, we've put people up for parliament, we've been pushed aside, and that's why we've gone to Kalashnikovs and fighting. Now, I have to say, what I didn't say earlier is, and this isn't germane to what you just asked, but it's important, there are now approximately, initially there were two main groups. Yes, the Sudanese Liberation Army, SLA, and GEM. Now there are approximately 30 rebel groups, factions, and they're now fighting amongst themselves. They're now attacking their own people in IDP camps. They're fighting the Janjaweed, they're fighting the government, and they're causing as many problems as the Janjaweed and the government. In fact, some people have described Darfur as pure chaos now. Because there are so many factions that are going against one another. So those rebel groups, and the reason they break off is because they have different points of view. They have leaders who want to share the power, and a lot of those smaller rebel groups are not invited to the peace talks, and they say, hey, you sign a peace talk, we don't agree, we keep fighting. So that's another problem that needs to be addressed. And in 2004, 2005, there wasn't that problem. Today, there's a problem of that magnitude, and it has exacerbated the problem and is going to continue to do so.